Okay, so how many here have heard of the term the social contract theory? Okay. I get a couple people. Oh yeah, some people who are like interested in this kind of stuff, right? Okay, so the social contract theory is a political philosophy that basically says this. It basically says that governments maintain their legitimacy and power when people agree to uphold the government's legitimacy and power if there are certain conditions that are met, that if the government kind of keeps their end of this it's not a real contract, right, of this contract by maintaining, and then you can fill in the blank of what that is, okay? And you're like, that was a terrible explanation. I don't understand that at all. So one example that a lot of people point to is actually China. Right? So so one way to look at it is that a couple of decades ago, probably in, depending on how you look at it, the 70s or 80s, they would say the government of China, the Communist Party, kind of entered into a social contract with the people. And it basically was this. It was, people, if you give up the idea of Western freedoms, we will give you Western wealth and affluence. That was kind of like the idea, right? And this is not like a literal like contract that people sign, but like this is what was going on, that the government was like, hey, we're going to take care of you. You're going to prosper, and like, hey, don't be looking for freedoms. And it worked, right? We looked at the last several decades. China's government and economy has gotten huge. It's really powerful, and it's the second biggest economy in the world, and all that kind of stuff, right? And so like these political science people would say, well, that's like the social contract, and it will break down if the government was unable to deliver on their promise, which was economic wealth. And so now some people are like, like thinking about like, oh, now look at the instability here and all that, and they're like, oh no, is this going to break down? And so that's what they try to predict, that kind of stuff, right? And we actually see this play out not just in China, but actually all over the world. We saw this after COVID, okay? And so what happened after COVID was everybody all over the world dealt with massive inflation, right? That was everybody. It wasn't just us. I mean, we complained about it here, but actually we had it pretty good. The rest of the world, I mean, some of these countries, massive inflation. And so when it came to election time, all over the world, what you saw was a lot of incumbent governments and incumbent parties within their governments, they all lost. And there was this big shift everywhere, right? Where like, this country, I mean, if you saw it actually right here in the US, right? You saw it in the UK, South Korea, Japan, African countries like Botswana, South Africa, India, France, all of them, right? They either lost a lot of power. And it's just a really interesting thing, because if you like this kind of stuff, you think about like what actually are the big movers and shakers. And so this theory would say, hey, it's like it's not about ideology. It's about, hey, when things go wrong, when your basic needs are not fulfilled, people will just want whoever's in power out, get the next guy in, just because we just want change, right? And that was actually happening here in America. A lot of people, I don't know if you pay attention to this, were like, oh my goodness, this will be the closest election ever, and da-da-da. And they were asking, hey, what's the thing that's going to really decide it, right? And there's all sorts of ideas. And then now after the election, the people have looked at the data and they're like, oh, actually, one of the main things was the economy. That was one of the big deciding factors. And then all of a sudden people are like, oh, that's kind of boring, because we all knew this, right? There's a guy, this is in 1992, James Carville. He's a political strategist, right? If you saw his face or heard his voice, you'll remember. He has a very unique face. He has a very unique voice. I just don't know what about it. It's just like you see him once, you're like, never has God created anyone just like this guy. He's like so unique in how he looks and how he talks. But he's a political strategist for Clinton, and basically back in 92, he had this famous like phrase or term. Basically, he said, "It's the economy, stupid." He's like, in the end, people can talk about all these different issues, but in the end, it's the economy that motivates the people on how they vote, because that's the thing that they really care about, because that's That's happening to their families, right? All these little like different cultural war topics, that people get upset about. So the social contract theory would say, well, actually, in the end, it's like there's certain things that people really care about, and a lot of it is kind of like what's affecting them. All right. So in America, it's like it's the economy, and so a lot of like if you ever go into like politics, or even as like a strategist, like you learn about this stuff, right? I share this because this is actually kind of happening where we're at in 1 Samuel. Okay. It's not obviously about inflation and that kind of stuff, but there's something there. There's something there that people want what they want, and it could be whatever. Okay, and so it's happening here in 1 Samuel. Let me give you a little bit of context on the timeline of 1 Samuel. Okay, it comes right after Judges. So we had been in the book of Judges, and here's like, okay, here's the timeline. There's a lot of time that's happening, and then we did a series on Ruth. We talked about how Ruth is actually happening while the book of Judges is going on. It's like a like a spin-off show, right? And it's actually happening more in the beginning of the book of Judges. Now we're in 1 Samuel. Now we're kind of like, this is more like a sequel to Judges. In fact, a lot of people consider Samuel to be Israel's last judge, right? And so, but he gets his own book because he's like a superstar, right? Now, Samuel did have some sons who were also judges, but they were terrible. So most people are just like, just ignore them. Samuel, you're the last judge. Your sons don't count, right? But that's kind of where we're at. And one of the neat things, and I just find this interesting. It's really not important to the message, but Samuel was born probably during the time of Samson, right? And because a lot of times we read the Bible, we think it's all just one thing happens, stop. Next thing happens, stop. But a lot of this it's happening all right. Like Ruth is happening while Judges are going on. Samuel is born while Samson was doing his thing. Okay, so I just think it's kind of neat where a lot of this is like connected and that kind of stuff, right? So that's what's going on. Now the Philistines have become a problem again in Samuel, right? And so at the end of Samson, right, the temple the temple of Dagon fell. A lot of the Philistine rulers were killed, and then they saw some period of peace. But again, okay, so you like knocked out a couple of their rulers, but that doesn't take out all the Philistines. So they regrouped, they became powerful again, and now they're a big problem for the Israelites again. Okay, so that is kind of like the big timeline and context of 1 Samuel. We are doing chapters 1 to 13 today. We could like have a whole year series just on 1 to 13. We're not going to do that. What I'm going to do is I'm going to give you a super fast overview of the 13 chapters of what's going on, and then we will kind of dive in and focus on a couple of specific things, and then we'll go from there. Okay? Okay. But that's why I really encourage you to kind of read this stuff beforehand, just so when I'm flying through here, you're not completely lost. But you're like, oh yeah, I remember this. Okay? Okay. Here we go. Chapter 1. Okay, the birth of Samuel and his dedication. Right, Samuel and Samson actually have interesting like birth stories. Right, they have there's miracles involved here because their moms were both unable to have kids until God kind of intervenes here. Right, and so Samuel's mom is Hannah. And afterwards, what Hannah does is she promises to dedicate this child, Samuel, to God, to serve God. And so when Samuel is weaned just for young people, that just simply means when a baby can now like eat real food, right? So that's what weaned means. And so once Samuel is weaned, Hannah then brings Samuel to Eli the priest, and so Samuel now serves with Eli and under Eli in the temple. Okay, so that's chapter 1. Chapter 2 is this really beautiful prayer that Hannah gives that just like thanks the Lord and just like praises God for what God has done. And then we also learn about Eli's son. The priest Eli has these sons. They were terrible. And then there's this prophecy against Eli and his sons. Right. This is the So Eli and his sons there's a prophecy over them that things are not going to go well for them, right? And we also learned that Hannah has more children, 3 more sons and 2 more daughters. And this, I just want to pause real quick. I love that little detail because sometimes we think God asks a lot of us, right? It's like, oh wow, God's going to give Hannah this child that she really wanted, and now like she's basically giving him up to like serve him. Like, oh, but yet God gives Hannah, who couldn't have children, 5 more kids, right? And I think this just shows when we give to the Lord, when we sacrifice and serve God, it's not really a sacrifice. God gives us even more, right? And so if you ever feel like, like giving is hard and sacrificing is hard and serving is hard because you're giving your time and that kind of stuff, just know God takes that, God honors that, and God then returns and gives us even more. Okay. All right. Chapter 3, God speaks to Samuel. This is that famous story in the Bible where God calls Samuel at night when he's his little kid, and at first he thinks it's Eli, and goes to Eli a couple times, and Eli's like, whoa, what you're hearing is from God. And there's that famous line where Eli tells Samuel, hey, next time you hear this, say this. Speak. This is in chapter 3, verse 10. Speak, for your servant is listening. Speak, for your servant is listening. And every time I read that, I just think, may our hearts, our ears, and our minds be the same. That may we say to the Lord, speak, your servant is listening. So then we get to chapters 4 to 7. Now I just want to pause real quick of how we're going to do this series. We're actually doing chapters 4 to 7 next week. So we're going to kind of really go through this quick, and then Pastor Dan is actually speaking next week, and he's going to kind of focus in on 4 to 7. Okay? So chapters 4 to 7, the ark is captured and restored, right? And so Israel is fighting the Philistines, and they're losing. And so they're thinking, hey, how do we win? Let's bring the Ark of the Covenant with us, okay? And that will give us victory. Of course, they didn't ask God about this, so this is not going to be blessed by God. And so they lose, and God doesn't give them victory, and the ark is captured. Eli, the priest, his sons are killed, which fulfills the prophecy against them. And then when Eli hears about this, he's like, oh, sad, my sons are dead. But then when he hears that the ark is captured, that's when he's like, no! And because he's really old, he kind of falls off his chair, breaks his neck, and dies. And that fulfills the prophecy as well. Okay, and then the Philistines are like, yeah, we beat the Israelites, and look, we got their like precious ark, and so they bring the ark and kind of like parade it around. But everywhere they bring the ark, terrible things happen to the city, and eventually people are like, hey, I don't want that ark here. Bring it to another city, and they're like, you guys take it, and no one wants that ark because clearly the message that the Philistines are saying is our God is greater than the Israelites' God, and God's not going to stand for that. And so eventually the Philistines are like, you know what, guys, just give it back. And so they give it back to the Israelites. And then at the end of chapter 7, the people kind of turn back to God, and Samuel leads them to victory. And this kind of establishes Samuel as like the judge, as the leader, right? And so by chapter 7, Samuel is not that little kid anymore. He's grown. Okay, so that's 4 to 7. All right, take a pause, deep breath. Chapter 8 and 9, okay? Long live the king. Israel wants a king, and they get Saul. All right, so that's kind of what's going on. Actually, in 2 weeks, we're going to come back and kind of focus in on chapters 8 to 15. So you're like, whoa, we're starting to mix and match. But basically it's this. We're going to focus in 2 weeks on chapters 8 to 15, and that focus is going to be on Saul, the new king. Today, in 8 and 9 and all the way through 13, we're focusing in on Samuel. Okay, so just different characters, different focuses. All right? Okay, so we're going to come back to this a little bit deeper because actually chapters 8 and 9 is where we're going to park a little bit. But just very briefly, okay, the Israelites say, hey, we want a king. And Samuel thinks that's a bad idea. Says, no, God is your king. You don't need a king. You don't want a king. And the people says, yes, we want a king. And so Samuel goes and prays about this, and God tells Samuel, yeah, it's a bad idea, but you know what? If that's what people care about, if that's what they want, like if this is what they want, okay, all right, let's give them a king. And then Saul is chosen as king. That's chapters 8 and 9. Chapters 10 and 11, it's a good start. Saul starts off well, right? He does some stuff. He rescues the city of Jabesh from the Ammonites, and he does this thing where after he defeats the Ammonites, he doesn't do what most people do in that time, is just kill all the prisoners, because that's what they do back then. Saul actually shows mercy. So it's like, whoa, Saul, this guy, like, he's like the strong leader, but he also shows mercy. Hey, good job, buddy. Starts off well. And then in chapter 12, this is another chapter we're going to like pause a little bit in and go a little deeper. But chapter 12 is Samuel's farewell speech. Basically, Samuel is getting ready to retire, right? So he's the judge, he's the leader, but he's not a king. That's like, there's a difference between a judge and a king. But now the Israelites want a king. They get a king, Saul. And so Samuel's like, okay, my time as like your like military leader is kind of over. And so he's kind of getting ready to retire. He does this farewell message, but he's going to stay on. He does stay on as in more of a spiritual and advisory role. So he's still around, but he's just not like that judge character again, because they got Saul the king. And then in chapter 13, that's when Saul messes up. So Saul started well, but here we start to go. The wheels in the wagon fall off, right? And again, we're going to go deeper into this in 2 weeks, because in 2 weeks we're going to look at Saul and focus on him. Today we're focused on Samuel, right? But basically, Saul's getting ready for battle, and he's supposed to do this burnt offering, but Samuel like takes his time and doesn't get there in time, and so Saul doesn't wait, does the burnt offering himself, which the king is not supposed to do, and so and then things go downhill from there, and the Philistines really start to oppress the Israelites. Okay, 13 chapters done. Okay, all right. So that's what happens in these 13 chapters. Now, kind of let's just jump in and say, okay, what is going on? So we're focusing on chapters 8 and 9 and 12. All right, so chapters 8 and 9. What's the big deal with asking for a king? Okay, that's really the question we want to explore, because a lot of stuff happens, but what is the big deal here? So let's take a look at chapter 8 and let's figure this out, okay? So chapter 8, verse 6 to 8 says, but when they said, give us a king to lead us, this displeased Samuel. So he prayed to the Lord, and the Lord told him, listen to all that the people are saying to you. It is not you they have rejected, but they have rejected me as their king, as they have done from the day I brought them out of Egypt until this day, forsaking me and serving other gods. So they are doing to you. I think the question, as we kind of see the Israelites' heart, the question we have to ask ourselves is, who is your king? Who is your king? I think if we're really honest with ourselves, we've all at some point in our lives valued something, wanted something over God. If we're really honest with ourselves, there's always things in our life that kind of goes above the Lord. Because remember, as we read this stuff, as we read the Bible, we are the Israelites. Don't ever read these stories and think, oh yeah, it's them. If your faith ever kind of gets to that point where you're always thinking about them, you've gone way off, right? You should read this as me, us. Who is your king? And if we're really honest, we know all of us at certain times in our lives kind of value different things, value different people, have different goals that kind of sneak its way up, sometimes get more important than God himself. Okay, so then we move on to, we're still in chapter 8, verses 9 to 18. This is a big, long one, but it's an important one, right? And so God says, now listen to them, but warn them solemnly. and let them know what the king who will reign over them will claim as his rights. This is what the king who will reign over you, this is what the king who will reign over you will claim as his rights. He will take your sons and make them serve with his chariots and horses. Some he will assign to be commanders of thousands and commanders of 50s, and others to plow his ground and reap his harvest, and still others to make weapons of war and equipment for his chariots. He will take your daughters to be perfumers and cooks and bakers. He will take the best of your fields and vineyards and olive groves. He will take a tenth of your grain, your male and female servants, and the best of your cattle and donkeys. He will take for his own use. He will take a tenth of your flocks, and you yourselves will become his slaves. When that day comes, you will cry out for relief from the king you have chosen, but the Lord will not answer you in that day. I read all that. It's a big chunk. I could have just told you that, but I read all that because Scripture often warns us about what will happen when we make idols of things. Right? God is not unclear about it. He's very clear. When you make idols of things, this is what's going to happen. And do we listen? Well, let's find out what the Israelites say, right? Because they've just heard all this. And then in chapter 8, verse 19 and 20. But the people refused to listen to Samuel. No, they said, we want a king over us. Then we will be like all the other nations, with a king to lead us. This is us, right? Again, this is us. This is how we are. We always, we want to be like everyone else, right? God calls us to be his holy people. That word holy simply means set apart, right? So we are to be set apart, and yet our heart's desire so often is always to be like everyone else. And so that's why it's a big deal to ask for a king. It's not just about, hey, we want a leader. This is about the heart of the matter, right? It's about rejecting God and saying, we want to be like everyone else. God, you've called us to be set apart and holy. No. We just want to be like everyone else. And we're going to take things in our life and we're going to put them as idols, and they will be ahead of you. That's what's really happening here. That's why it's such a big deal when they asked for a king. Okay? So that's chapters 8 and 9. That's really important. And now we're going to jump to chapter 12, and then we're going to focus on that one a little bit, and that's how we'll finish up. Right? Chapter 12, the final word. This is Samuel's farewell speech. He basically goes back and lists all the great things God has done for the Israelites and how they continue to reject God. Right? So that's basically his speech. And then he does this miracle with thunder and rain, and when that happens, the people are convicted and they finally believe. Of course, this is after they've already gotten Saul as a king, right? And so they're like, oh no, what have we done? And so then Samuel says in chapter 12, verse 20 to 22, he says this, "Do not be afraid," Samuel replied. "You have done all this evil, yet do not turn away from the Lord, but serve the Lord with all your heart. Do not turn away after useless idols. They can do you no good, nor can they rescue you, because they are useless. For the sake of his great name, the Lord will not reject his people, because the Lord was pleased to make you his own." And that last line, that is the key. The Lord was pleased to make you his own. Do you ever think about that? Do you ever think about that God is pleased to make you his own? I think in Asian culture, if that's how you grew up, Asian culture is a shame-based culture, and that it makes it really easy, because this is culturally natural for us. It really makes it really easy for us to feel a lot of shame as we reflect on our lives and as we reflect on our sin. Okay, that's a cultural reality for us, right? If that's how you grew up, and I think most of us here grew up in an Asian culture, it's shame-based. So when we sit and think, what have I done? How have I followed the Lord? And we naturally go to like, yeah, man, I didn't do this well. I continue to do this to do this poorly. You know, I'm not doing my quiet time. I'm not doing that. It's so easy for us to just feel shame. Okay, that's natural for us. And so I think this verse, the Lord is pleased to make you his own, is so important to us. Like maybe a little extra more important, bad grammar there, but extra more important than for other people of other cultures. They're studying scripture, right? For us, the Lord was pleased to make you his own is so important because that's just not how we think a lot of times. And so for us today, I think there's two things that we can really take from this that's really important. I think the first thing is this: make God your king. Don't let the things of this world become king of your life. Right? Even good things can become an idol. Right? And I think the good things are especially easy to make an idol because they're good things. There's things you should do, right? We can make education an idol. We can make relationships an idol. We can make wealth an idol. We can make status an idol. We can make a nation, America, an idol. We can make an ideology, a political ideology, an idol. None of those are bad in itself, but it's easy for us because that's how we are. That's how people are. We want what we want. We want to be like everyone else. It's so easy for us to kind of make those an idol. So don't do it. Make God your king. And the second thing is this: rest and live in the fact that God is pleased with you. That I wrote rest and live. It's like there's a reason why I wrote that, right? I think part of it is we can get so down on ourselves and feel ashamed of how we aren't following the Lord and that kind of stuff. And that just gives us stress. It does not give us rest, right? And so rest in that fact that God is pleased with you. And then also live, right? Living is more of an action thing, right? Live and make your decisions and do the things you do with the knowledge and fact that God is pleased with you, right? So no matter what you've done, your starting point is that God is pleased with me, right? Because if that's your starting point and you kind of know that deep in your heart, God is pleased with me, that changes how you make your decisions. I mean, think about if you were to, if someone who their core kind of thought is, God is not pleased with me. I'm a sinner. God really wants to smite me, but because I said this prayer, God can't, right? I think a lot of people feel that way. It's like God really is like angry with me, but I said that prayer and accepted Jesus, and God's like, I can't get him, right? That is, I think a lot of people, like that's their starting point in their brain, in their heart, and that is not how God is. But now, if your starting point is, God is pleased with me, whatever I've done, whatever I'm going to do, whatever I failed at, whatever I've rejected of him, no, God is pleased with me. Oh, that changes everything. And now, this is totally not a license to sin. And I don't think that for again, Asians, our culture, that's not how we think. But if that is how you think, no, it's totally not a license to just do whatever and sin. But what it does, it gives you that boost to obey. It's a lot easier to obey when you know that God is like, yeah, I'm pleased with you. Oh, you messed up? Yeah, okay. I am still pleased. I am pleased to make you, my own, right? And so live in that fact. right? And may that be the thing that kind of propels you to live for God and how you make your decisions. Let's pray.